Athlete podcast. Today we actually are talking about a subject that is near and dear to all of our hearts, and our guest joining us is going to be Alberto Nunez from Team 3D Muscle Journey, who has been an influencer and a coach for, I know Eric and I, and then has been working very closely alongside Eric Helms, who is Bryce's coach. So if you want to say what up, Alberto.
And I starved Chris Aiden at some point. I managed to do that. So
before we get too far into the episode, just a quick shout out to the sponsor for the Strength Athlete podcast. That is going to be LVD Fitness. You can find them at www.lvdfitness.com. They are giving away clean water for every single item purchased at their website. So please go check them out and support them. They are doing good things. And one additional piece that I always forget to mention, but if you are loving our podcast and you want us to make more of them, lots more reviews in the iTunes store helps people to see us and helps us to promote our show. So please do leave us a 5-star review in the iTunes store, as it does help us to help you to see our beautiful faces just a little bit more. So getting into the topic for today, this is something that kind of came up last week, talking to athletes I was coaching and seeing other athletes that I wasn't coaching. And I know this was something that was on your mind as well, guys. And Alberto, you've kind of beaten the drum of this subject with me a number of times, is recovery. And, you know, we're, as powerlifters, we're always thinking about how can we train harder? How can we do more? And whereas, you know, Alberto, I think you have this almost opposite mentality. How can I get as much done while doing less? And that's kind of the bodybuilding approach to, as you make your way through the diet and you have less and less available resources in terms of energy, is, you know, how can we achieve the same end effect while also not really spending so much along the way? And, you know, in the world of powerlifting, where we're always pushing to do more, you know, you kind of have to rob Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, in terms of recovery. You only have so much to give, and so you can only push so hard, so you have to start kind of adding in other places. And if you're watching the video, you can see everybody giggling, because this is a very famous Alberto Nunez expression, rob Peter to pay Paul, or the Mexican version, rob Pedro to pay Pablo. And but anyway, so, you know, we'll start, Bryce. I was talking to you earlier mostly about stress, and I would like to, you know, if you can kind of expand upon what we're thinking about when we're talking stressors, both positive and negative, with regards to training and how they can impact us.
Yeah, for sure. So next time we do this, I'll have a little bit more prepared, but the body really doesn't have unique systems to deal with training stress versus stress from stuck in your daily commute as you drive to work, or being late on a deadline for some job or something like that. We kind of draw from the same pool for all these different stressors, and they're additive. So, you know, if we have a lot of life stressors, which is generally the case for most modern people, it kind of gives us less in the tank for recovering from training stress, and vice versa. If you were training as a full-time athlete, you probably couldn't keep up a full-time job as well in terms of just general stressors. So there have been some real studies on undergraduate students using stuff like the Undergraduate Stress Questionnaire and different versions for adult populations, to show that there's a real trade-off in higher stress populations versus their ability to recover adequately from training.
So do you think that there's some kind of mental marker we can kind of keep a tab on as we go to kind of track where we're at relative to that? I think motivation is a really easy one. And generally speaking, we do have most of our athletes track motivation, and it's just a simple 1 to 5 scale. Like, how much do I want to be in the gym today? And even something like that can go a really long way. You know, I found myself, me personally, coming back from Raw Nationals, I described the way I was feeling to somebody, and they said that it seems to me like you're on the back end of a cocaine bender, is like what your body feels like right now. And it was just, I had so many highs and lows through the course of the week, and, you know, so many different types of stressors. I got home and all I wanted to do was lay in bed. And so that's obviously a very magnified scale and a very specific and very exhaustive example. But when you apply that on the micro scale over the course of, you know, a little bit of a stressor at work, you're boss asking for his covers on his TPS reports, and, you know, getting it right here and there, and little bits and pieces over the course of a week, and you have your heavy squat session on Saturday, you know, you're not going to go into that, number one, feeling as motivated or physically being as prepared.
Yeah, and, you know, we've seen that in tons of different cases, from people having kids, or their wife having kids, and we'll talk about this a little bit later when we get into sleep, I guess. But sticking with stress itself, we can use things like the Undergraduate stress questionnaire, which it essentially just puts a number value on certain questions like, you know, how many times are your thoughts drifting towards finals, or how much time are you spending studying, or you know, are you thinking about money, or are you thinking about grades, or all the rest of these things. And so it just attaches a point value, and there's versions of those for the real world. If that's too much effort, and it probably is for most people, we can boil it down to a single number and just track how that number changes over time. A dynamometer, like a grip thing, can be a pretty good identifier of readiness, I think, too, to perform training.
I think Mike T did some research on that. One of his little research projects that involved a bunch of athletes, I think he actually did something with that. I don't remember what the conclusion was, so not really useful to bring up at this point, but I think he did it. So Alberto, what are we missing here in terms of stress? What do you look at that we haven't mentioned?
Well, I think when we think of nutrition, I know that for the longest time I always thought of stress eating as something negative. It's something that you don't want to do, but when you think about it, we all kind of are. We are stress eaters in that when you undereat, you're not able to recover from your training stress. And if you do it long enough, it just starts to, like in my boat, I'm in the middle of a contest prep, and your body becomes more transparent when you've been starving yourself slowly for about 5 months now. And it really makes you aware that, shoot, like this food that's coming in is at this point not enough, and it's affecting not just my ability to recover from training, but like the whole hangry things that when I'm well fed, I'm like, okay, whatever, like not so much right now. In regards to like what amount of stress I take on at this point, because I am very close to a string of very important competitions, which means that I'm starving way more than I was in the beginning of the prep, and it's been going on for a while. I'm also careful in regards to how much of that, because I only have so much that I'm allowed to put in my body to recover from. So yeah, I know that they're quite connected. It makes sense, but to experience it yourself at this point, it's like, wow, yeah, it makes me almost reconsider once I'm eating enough. Again, because they're all moving parts, how perhaps I need to downsize this portion of my life or that portion of my life, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think being an athlete just by default makes you a little bit more aware in regards to how stress plays a role and how effective you are when it comes to everything. And that's where sleep and nutrition are super important and often forgotten about.
So, Berto, do you think the caloric needs for somebody with a lot of life stresses changes, or excuse me, is it something where even if their physical activity level isn't changing too much, if they're just taking on a lot of things, is that something that's going to change their caloric needs?
Yeah, to a certain extent, for sure. Like maybe if you're planning a fat loss diet and life just isn't really catering to that right now, it's maybe something you should reconsider. But also, I think within the total amount of calories, one thing that's often overlooked, and it's like such a duh thing, is just protein intake. It's how I've managed to starve myself to a certain extent, and I starve lots of athletes every single year. It all kind of revolves around that protein intake. Super important. Bodybuilders do a good job with it. Perhaps sometimes they overemphasize it. And I think, if anything, sometimes powerlifters tend to undermine the power of the protein.
Yeah, I was going to say powerlifters tend to neglect that a little more often because they're usually a little more free with their diet and tend to kind of fill the calorie gaps more with fat and carbs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Don't hate on fat and carbs, man.
Oh, I'm not.
Berto, while you were talking, I came up with a few questions that I'm hoping you can help out with. Number one, you mentioned that kind of increases in calories really help with recovery. To what extent? So, if I'm eating in a 300 to 500 caloric surplus, calorie caloric surplus, like that's going to help with recovery. But is more going to make me recover that much more? or is that just going to allow me to gain body weight and muscle mass a little bit faster?
Yeah, there's definitely a point of diminishing returns when it comes to caloric intake, for sure. I would say that even within a hypocaloric setting, if protein is high enough, it kind of lets you get away with a little bit more. But at the same time, I think, like you mentioned, like a 300, 500 calorie surplus, which I think is too much for some people, over time can lead to too much weight gain. Those excess calories in later on, which we'll get into at some point, can become a problem in that you have to take them off, especially in a weight class sport, and it might be at the wrong time, during the wrong time in your training cycle. So absolutely, yeah, there is a certain point where you're not really getting much more, kind of like training. You can't just throw more in there and expect to continue to recover. But yeah, an obvious caloric surplus is going to make you better at many things, especially your training. And that's, I think all of us at some point, especially as men, we've gone through these it's all muscle bro training phases. And one of the reasons that we stayed there, it's because we kept seeing super predictable progress. It almost seemed like the more we ate, the more we gained, and that's why we were convinced that it was all muscle. And then also this came during most likely early intermediate phases where to a certain extent you can get away with a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. And my next question, as we'll kind of realize, a lot of these concepts are interrelated with nutrition, stress, and sleep, and the like. I know of some athletes who, when they are highly stressed, they lose weight, and other athletes who are highly stressed and gain weight. Have you found anything that distinguishes which one of these directions someone might go?
Yeah, and this all goes back usually to root habits. So, for example, if when you were a kid, your parents gave you an ice cream cone, for example, when you were trying to shut your mouth, you're more likely to basically go lean towards that, maybe a little bit too much during times of stress. Whereas in my case, I'm a behavioral ectomorph. I am that child that mother had to call in over and over to come in the house, stop playing. You haven't eaten like 10 hours. When I stress, even when dieting, that's where I tend to gravitate towards. So yeah, highly important that when you are to know when you are overwhelmed, what is it that you tend to do nutritionally?
That kind of that touches on something I didn't want to skip before we got too far into nutrition, is the idea that some people, when they're highly stressed, be it work or training or anything, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten athlete updates that said, "Oh man, I've just been so stressed this week. I've been way off the mark with my nutrition and been like 500 calories short every day." And that tends to create this downward spiral effect, right? It's like, sure, one day here and there, not a huge deal. It's a drop in the pond, and when you average it out over long enough, it works out fine. But if over the course of the week, you're 300 to 500 calories short every day because you get home from work and you just want to lay down in bed, that really starts to add up. You're talking about a substantial deduction from available resources to recover from what is, if you're talking competition prep, what is very recovery demanding training. And so, for people in those cases, and, this comes to kind of a know thyself sort of thing. If you have a competition prep coming up, this can be relevant for people who are going to be preparing for the Arnold Sports Festival or for any upcoming meets. If you have 8 or 12 weeks of prep beforehand, and you know that you have a big work project coming up right in the middle of that, hold yourself accountable. If you don't normally track your food, it might be wise to do so during that period, and to essentially equip yourself for success, or to have a meal waiting for you at home. Take advantage of a meal prep service for that 4 weeks of your life, and essentially build this foundation on which it is harder for you to be unsuccessful in that scenario. You know yourself. Very rarely is it the first time you've ever been so stressed that you don't eat. I can tell you for a fact that's never, ever happened to me in my life. I was the ice cream cone kid that Alberto described. And I went back for a second ice cream cone. I was like, oh, I feel a little better. Give me another one. And so, and that's kind of how my whole life has been. I'm a stress eater. It's like, oh man, let me drown my sorrows. And it's not alcohol. It's not any other type of substance. It is just food. And I find that so fulfilling on such a core level for me. And so I have to control myself on the opposite side. So if I'm especially stressed from work, I have to keep track of what I'm eating. I'm like, man, I just ate an hour ago. I don't need to eat again. And the inverse applies for some, but knowing what you gravitate toward and knowing how to combat that can go a long way towards making yourself more successful, not just in this prep, but in the long term, because the 4 weeks, 4 weeks right now might not seem like it's going to have a huge effect 18 months from now. But if that's 4 weeks out of every 12, and that's 4 times a year, it really starts to add up, and it becomes those little 1% things that, small drop, but big long-term effect if you do it often enough.
Yeah.
Well, and here's the issue with, I guess, people who tend to overeat when they're stressed, is that it's never like, I'm stressed, I can go for some whey protein. It's usually, I'm stressed, I can go for some Doritos.
Nacho cheese Doritos.
That's something to add to that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's true. It's comforting high-calorie foods usually.
Yeah. Honestly, I'll pay any amount of money for someone who can make broccoli that tastes like nacho cheese Doritos. I've been asking for this for years. I would be a very happy man if that were the case.
As an interesting and totally tangential aside, Coca-Cola is paying. There's like $1 million reward out for someone that can find a new sweetener, because they're in a really tough spot right now, because sugar is demonized, by the general consumer. People don't want to buy a beverage with sugar, but they also don't want to buy a beverage with, quote unquote artificial sweeteners, because they have a negative stigma too. So they want people to come up with something that tastes good, but doesn't have either of those negative stigmas. So it's a really interesting challenge.
That should be worth a lot more than $1 million to them.
I agree.
Yeah, because they're going to buy out the rights to use it outright, and it's going to be $1 billion product. But
right.
What can you do? That's the sucker who comes up with it and sells out for $1 million. Good for that guy.
So I wanted to stay with stress a little bit, because there's so many different topics we can talk about. But if you have an athlete who is stressed, or if you're stressed yourself, how do you leave that outside the gym when you get in, so that you can just focus on what you're trying to do?
And just to backstep a little bit, I think one thing that we all kind of do, and I don't know if you guys have ever been personal trainers, but it used to be a frustration of my own that you would get a client and they would tell you what they wanted, but they weren't necessarily all the way aware of what they needed, right? And it's our job, even now as coaches, like even with really high level athletes, it's like, okay, they kind of know what they want, they know some of their basic needs, but your objectivity as a coach lets you get past that. One thing that I feel, especially when we're talking about just first off nutritional interventions for powerlifters, is to create systems where the behavior can be as automated as possible. So for example, in Hani's case, maybe he's a stress eater and he's just plowing down through all the cheap baked goods from Walmart that he got last weekend. If you were to throw in something in, say, his system where basically it's like, okay, well, you can kind of sort of have that, try not to have too much, but let's go ahead and have, say, 5 protein feedings a day that we have at this time, and that time. And athletes are generally really good at adopting new systems, especially when they're structured. Of course, they have to be appropriate. It shouldn't be too different too soon, because then that in itself becomes a stress. Like I recall when the whole mobility thing was just like the thing to do, and everyone was like rolling around on their backs for like 1 hour before they actually got to their first working set.
That's still a thing. People still do that. Just gonna put that out there. Okay.
Nice. By the way, Bryce, I took your sauna idea. It's wonderful. That's how I warm up now.
I'm glad.
Way more efficient. Yeah. But I remember when that was taken off, my issue was, can I keep up with this, right? That was my question. So I think, yeah, we want to create a better environment, but it's something that we need to gravitate towards slowly, just like we would with a general population person. Maybe to start off, soccer mom X needs Let's just focus on getting veggies 4 times a day. Let's stop and have 2 big protein meals each day. Same thing goes with athletes in their environments. Like, you know where you want to get to, but it's something that's going to have to be slow, and especially when it comes to nutrition, because adherence, even for bodybuilders, it's an issue. They think they are like perfect at it, but they're furthest thing from the truth. I think in all my years coaching, I can think of 2 athletes that are just actually like truly robots. And everyone else, like, we're like 80-90% good. And it took a while to get up until that point. So as you transition an athlete to a better environment, you need to create these automated systems that they don't have to think about. It's just goals for the week, whether it be get your 60 hours of sleep, stop 60 hours of sleep a week, stop, eat protein. We'll start with 3 times because you do a horrible job at this point eating it once a day. And you move on from there. So it's kind of like, it's kind of like loading up a bar, right? It's they know what they want to lift, they know what they should be lifting, but it's going to be a process. And I think especially now that power, and it's kind of refreshing because talking about macros and stuff, it was just, I'd say 5 years ago was such a jargony word in the bodybuilding world. No one really knew about it. So now the fact that, bodybuilders can identify with that lingo and they actually at least attempt to apply it from time to time. And they know that there's something about those macros and hitting your protein, hitting your carbs, hitting your fat that it's going to contribute to their training. It might not be realistic to get to work on all that now, and it's going to have to be a process.
So, okay. So, and it's almost kind of like the concept is periodization for nutrition is what you're thinking of. It's, you take a little bit so you can take a little more and so on and so forth. And, eventually once in a while you get that nutritional deload where you go out and you eat all the Walmart baked goods. But yeah, and I think something we haven't mentioned so far that can definitely have value for some. And, I haven't tried this myself, but I've heard good feedback from several people is, let's say someone's nutrition is nailed down, right? They're getting their 5 protein feedings a day. They're eating enough calories. They're in a slight surplus, 250 calorie surplus. Their training is balanced enough so it fits in their day well, but their work is high stress. Their training is relatively high stress. They're 6 weeks out from a competition. There's nothing they can change at this point. They can't eat anymore because they can't gain weight. So there are ways that we can actively try to reduce kind of the impact the stress will have on us in terms of our daily lives. And so this is something I was talking to you about, Bryce, earlier, and I really don't know a whole lot about it, but I picked Ben Rice's brain a little bit as he does this. And so it's, forms of meditation for short periods of time each day. He himself uses what's called mindfulness meditation, I believe.
Yeah.
And the way he explained it to me is that you essentially, it's this series of steps that you take, and it kind of just essentially removes you from the situation and helps you to understand that the stress doesn't impact you as much as you think it does, and helps you to feel a little bit better about it. And maybe that takes 5 or 10 minutes out of his day. But in situations like that, I think investing a little bit of time and serving yourself, and that can be done in a number of ways, right? If that means taking 10 minutes and reading a book at the end of every day that helps to kind of calm you down and center you, I think investing that time, taking that time and doing that can go a long way towards just feeling better. And with all the stressors still there, and with the needs for recovery being just as high, that 5% difference in how you feel about even just laying down in bed can go such a long way, I think.
And Hani, I want to bridge off that just to say that stressors are just things that happen in life, and we kind of get to choose how we interpret those and internalize them. You know what I mean? So the same situation, maybe my bank account is $0 or something like that, can be massively stressing to one person and not as stressing to someone else, just because of how they choose to live their life and how they interpret things. So I think understanding that we have more control than we might think empowers people to kind of make better decisions. But yeah, that mindfulness thing, from what I'm aware of, essentially teaches you to view thoughts as just things that kind of pass over you, as this kind of constant chatter that you can tune in and you can listen to it, or you can tune out, essentially teaching you to control your attention and awareness to a better degree. And even if you don't stick with a practice like that, and the research is somewhat ambivalent on exactly what mindfulness and meditation actually do, I think it's a good tool to add to your tool belt.
Right. Well, what you said earlier was that Quinn Hennock had discussed the idea of taking slow, controlled breaths at night, and in an attempt to reach a parasympathetic state. I think was what we were talking about. And any investment like that, basically just calming yourself down, focused calming of yourself once a day, in whatever that form may be. That could be taking a bath, that could be sitting in a sauna, that could be reading a book or practicing meditation of some kind. But 5 or 10 minutes of that a day in a high stress scenario, you may find that it doesn't do anything for you, but you may find at the end of the week that you just generally feel a little bit better and you're not really sure why. And I mean, in my case, that's a trade-off I'd be willing to make. I can spare 5 minutes a day for that.
Yeah, for sure.
So keeping us on track here, let's kind of move more specifically into nutrition, and we've kind of touched the edge of this with several of the kind of related stress topics, as obviously stress and nutrition can very much go hand in hand when you're talking about stress eaters or stress undereaters. So Alberto, I think this is definitely more your arena. So as a starting point, what in general do you see powerlifters doing wrong? I mean, I think I have some idea, but from the many that you've coached, what have you observed is the most common theme among things we mess up?
I would say, and it's easier said than done to get an athlete into this position because it takes a lot of planning throughout the whole year. But entering specific blocks in your training where you want a very predictable outcome in regards to recovery. So as you're tapering into a meet, first of all, just the fact that you have a meet is quite stressing itself. You have a deadline now that was pretty far away at some point, and now you're like 3 weeks out. But dieting through that phase, dieting is going to make how you recover from even the most perfect of program so much more erratic. So if there's one thing, I wish powerlifters could almost get themselves to the point where, as they're tapering, instead of being over their weight class, they're a bit underneath that weight class. And that experience that we had in regards to, it's all muscle, bro, we're power bulking. If there ever is a time to power bulk, it's probably going into the meet. Of course, it's not everyone's a candidate for that because it does take planning like far outside of the meet. You have to have good habits almost year round, or pretty damn good habits almost all year round. But that is probably the one thing that I notice quite frequently. And those are also the lifters. If we had some sort of poll, it's like, so who dieted into nationals, who won 9 for 9 and got the lifts they wanted? I think you'd see a very obvious trend that most lifters who diet into their meets are not as predictable as that person who's just chilling, for the most part, just having enough calories the whole way through. They were more likely to get what they wanted from their meet experience.
There's also, those handful of people who just weight cutted using just water manipulation pretty successfully, and they didn't really have to adjust calories overall very much. But, Alberto, for the people who are relatively close to their weight class limit and they're comfortable there for a while, it's not like they have a hard time cutting or want to bump up to the next weight class. What you're saying is that kind of as part of a structured plan, maybe have them drop a few pounds early in the training cycle so they can eat up late into the training cycle?
Yeah, I would. Because even if you do a water cut, like if you could avoid that would be fantastic. It's one less stress, one less thing to manage that week. You're just focused on your lifting. But yeah, I think, because again, it's not just that week. It's like the many weeks leading into that where, you want to be predictable. And yeah, being in a hypocaloric state during, I wouldn't say the most important block, but it's definitely, if there ever is a time where lifters are extra focused on every single detail, it's going into a meet. And having a lot of this happen can definitely add some unnecessary stress. So, yeah, if possible, I think, which again, not everyone's a candidate, just maybe based on their own situation. They're a really good lifter in that weight class. They wouldn't be quite as good in the next. So, and they're right there. But especially for early intermediates, I feel, where, the weight class maybe shouldn't matter too much, or even middle of the road intermediates, but more so on you getting your lifts and getting the most out of your own personal performance, which, again, it's a very hard buy-in for most powerlifters.
It's hard to, it's becoming increasingly easy. Or maybe this is just this is why there's a running joke that all my clients end up going up a weight class, but there's this mentality that there has to be some sort of dietary suffering associated with the difficulty of training going into a competition. It's like, oh yeah, I got to go down a weight class. Mm-hmm. And the fact of the matter is a lot of people are placing 17th regardless. And so it doesn't really matter. And yet they're kind of robbing themselves, short-term and long-term, by this really short-sighted focus on the weight class number. And, and I'm guilty of this myself. There was a time when I did this. Bryce, this is hard to imagine for you guys listening, but Bryce did weigh 180 pounds at one point. And it was absolutely shredded to the gills competing. But it was, and there's such a tremendous difference in strength. And I mean, that's directly observable in how much his performance has increased, going from, 181 to 205 when he switched over to USA Powerlifting, and then from 205 to 231 was the big, kind of the huge increase for you. And so and obviously not everyone can anticipate that. I definitely didn't get a 300-pound increase on my total when I went from 205 to 231, but there was definitely an associated improvement there. I got better, and we have the Wilks score that we can use to track that, right? Did you get relatively better? Probably. And Bryce, you definitely did. So it's dissociating from this kind of obsession with reducing weight classes when it's not necessary. Your placing isn't any better. Your relative strength isn't any higher. And so I don't know. I'm not really, man, maybe I'm just kind of jaded on the whole thing at this point, but I don't really see the point.
Let me just push back just a teeny bit. What do you say to the people who say, I want to be strong, but I want to look good too?
Oh, then you know what? That's fine. And you know that when you have like a personal, and I use the term vanity loosely here, but I think it's the right word. When you have like a vanity drive there as well, that's fine. But let's say physical appearance aside.
Yeah.
When we're talking about like the difference between a 63 and a 57 kilo female, physically they don't look all that different. If you're talking about someone who's around 5'3", 5'4", maybe a little bit leaner looking at 57, but ultimately very comparable. And so it's in times like that, ultimately I'm always going to yield to what people want. I mean, that's what we do, right? We enable people to reach their goals. But I always try to advise against it because I think it's generally the wrong move to make unless you stand to make some competitive advantage. So if someone was competing at 57 and they saw that, and they're a light 57, maybe they weigh 54, and they say, oh wow, if I lose 2 kilos, I could place top 3 at Raw Nationals in the 52s. That's a conversation that I think is worth having. But if you're not placing either way, if you're still making really healthy progress because you're early in your training career, if you have injuries that exist, if you're in any of these situations where you have no real reason to diet down, I almost universally try to advise against it.
I think it's less commonly seen in powerlifting because most lifters are going to feel exponentially stronger, even just weighing 5 or 10 pounds heavier. And they're willing to take that small performance hit with a last-minute weight manipulation. So if you have somebody training, let's say somebody who's in the 93 kilo class, if you have them training for a while at 200 pounds and they're eating up into the meat, they'll probably have a good meat performance relative to their training, but maybe it won't be better than if they were training at 210 and they did that last-minute weight cut. They spent that whole training cycle weighing 10 pounds heavier. So I think that might be worth discussing as well.
And here would be my counter to that. So for those of you guys who are maybe not familiar with the way bodybuilders structure their off seasons, it's not 6 months. It's usually, in order to make significant progress past that mid-intermediate phase, you go on these these long phases where you look like anything but a bodybuilder, at least in the eyes of these people. And this is where you make significant gains. And I think for anyone who is involved in either sport, both powerlifting and bodybuilding, you understand, or usually you want to do this for a long time. So maybe you are in a stage in your career where it might be in your best interest to perhaps get better at a slightly higher body weight. And as we're doing that, a lot of those good eating habits, a lot of those stress management habits that we're trying to build up, that should definitely be something you aim to improve on, not just training, but what you do to recover from that, those will grow. And I'll use myself as an example. When I first started bodybuilding, mind you, I compete at just under 160 pounds on stage. That is the appropriate look for me. That is me peaked. There was a time where I felt like I needed to be 200 pounds in order to get the most out of myself. And if you weren't 200 pounds and lifted weights, well, you really don't even lift. And what I've seen over the years, with every year is with every passing years, is my habits have gotten better themselves. Is that my off-season weight has slowly diminished. It's come down a little bit, and performance, I'm actually getting stronger. And this is in a sport where, if you just look at the way a bodybuilder should deadlift versus the way a powerlifter deadlifts, like, we are not necessarily hyper-focused on their neurological adaptations. We're trying to create as much stress to the system as possible. We're bringing it down with a slow eccentric, and we kind of want to take the body, shake it, and then hopefully eat in a way that eventually has us recovering and making progress. So it is something to consider for someone who might be in this block in their training career where they could potentially make a whole lot of progress. And yeah, you might have to do a few meets a weight class higher. You might have to do that for a few years, but then eventually you might get your chance. You might get to do the inverse of what Bryce did, come down a weight class when you're ready and be able to manage that much better. But that's a long game, and that's very hard to sell. But it's something that maybe if someone's listening, it might click with them, and they're like, shoot, that could be me. That's how I'm going to be competitive 5 years from now.
Right.
I think mentioning the long game is worth reemphasizing, and that's, we often don't deal with that, right? Because someone says, okay, I've got a competition in 14 weeks, I got to find a coach. We get we have a Skype call, and then there's 12 weeks to prep for the meet, and that's basically it. And it's a hard sell to say, I know you had these plans for this meet, but you should probably go up a weight class. You'll do better, and then we can have you ready for the meet in 28 weeks. Mm-hmm. And so it's not always rather, we don't always have ample time to make those kind of suggestions for people. But if we're talking about planning for being successful in that longer time frame, which not enough people do, quite frankly, but I absolutely agree with you, Alberto, that kind of focusing on that big picture goes such a long way.
And one more thing on the vanity side of things, I think most women, whether it be from powerlifting or bodybuilding, they come from backgrounds where they were usually concurrently trying to diet and lift weights. And in regards to body comp, like, if you get a female lifter stronger, you will see this over and over again. Their body comp will look tremendously better 3 years from now than the way it looks now. And all they really did is lift weights in a progressive manner. So that is one thing that, especially women who are a little bit more, I guess sometimes, for a number of different reasons outside of just the weight class, they feel pressured to look a certain way. It's like, hey, if we lift progressively for a long time, you're going to look better and better than you imagined, and via, I guess, a route that you wouldn't have thought would have been the answer: lifting weights and eating enough.
So, digging a little deeper nutritionally, let's kind of talk more specific things we can do on a daily basis. Obviously, the gist of what we've said so far is, be as fat as you can for as long as you can, and that's probably going to serve you best. And maybe that's a little bit too broad of a brushstroke, but obviously operating a little heavier, you're going to train better, you're going to recover better. We all understand that. So, but let's say, someone doesn't have that option. They're 12 weeks out. They can't gain any weight. What can they do on a daily basis, nutritionally speaking, to maximize their recovery from training and to get as much as possible out of it? And let's say we're talking about someone right at calorie maintenance, neither dieting nor weight gaining.
I would say that, again, protein is probably the one thing that I see way too frequently happen with powerlifters, that they forget just how much that seems to help with recovery. So I think one great habit that most powerlifters can get into right away is to make sure you have high quality protein 4 times a day. And as straightforward as that seems, a lot of people have trouble with that, especially when you're eating enough to the point where, it allows you to perhaps, it allows you to perhaps not be as aware of how you might be a little bit behind, or maybe not recovering from everything as efficiently as you would like. So I would say protein for sure. 4 times to start. 3 is okay. 3 is better than what I think most athletes do. And then along with that, just kind of being calorically aware. So if you can do that, because I think powerlifters, in regards to specific macros, I don't think you guys necessarily have to be on specific macros. If you control your calories and you control your protein intake because of the way you guys train relative to a bodybuilder, we don't have to emphasize that, we will prefer this amount of carbs. I think the going rate for 2 sets of hard bodybuilding training, so we're talking about like 12 reps with a good eccentric, I think it's 5 grams of carbs, 5 grams of carbs for 2 sets. So you guys have a lot of wiggle room when it comes to that.
Yeah, that's not so bad at all, just in terms of caloric demand. But Berto, I think you're mentioning that nutrition is really important for bodybuilders because weight management is important for bodybuilders. Like protein is equally important for both of these sports, but the breakdown is not as important for powerlifting. And what's the reason for that?
Simply because you guys don't work within those energy systems that I guess that use carbs as a preferred source of energy.
Okay.
So the other day I did 4 sets of 20 on a hack squat. Not too many powerlifters are doing that.
Sure.
And each set took well over a minute. So with you guys, it's more so what I would consider, the second tier is getting enough calories and being aware of your protein. And if you want to do a really, really good job, I think total protein matters more, but ensuring that you have it 3 to 4 times a day.
So you could, in those off-season blocks, like what a lot of athletes have coming up right now, post-round nationals, when they're in those higher rep ranges, paying a little more attention to detail in terms of getting adequate carbohydrate intake can go a long way towards better performance through this post-competing period.
Absolutely, yeah. If there ever is a time, it's probably when we're further away from a meet. But yeah, I think if most people could start with just being aware of their calories and protein, we're in a better place than most. And I think most lifters can adhere to that way more than trying to give them specific macros.
Totally. And I think the protein dosing throughout the day is easier than people imagine it to be. When you threw the number 5 out, and I know you and I have had this conversation before, and you held me very accountable to that in my last competition prep, and I'm trying to do that again now. Is that beer you're drinking?
Having a Dr. Pepper with friends. Okay. Yeah.
Just checking. That would have been really exciting mid-competition prep. But yeah, so the 5 feels like a lot, but I mean, really, when you break it down, it's breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and 2 protein shakes, and that's for 5, which is on the high end of the spectrum.
And here's the thing: I scaled it up to you because you've done the bodybuilding thing for a while, so I know that it's in there, and I know that it's something that's not asking too much from you. So
right.
Again, know your athlete and assign them things that they know they can get done in regards to nutritional intervention or any other sort of stress management.
Absolutely. Or four. Four would be very easy. That's just your 3 meals a day and one protein shake maybe before bed or somewhere else. It's really not a big ask to it's really not a big intervention for most people. It's not a big change. It's just being kind of cognizant of what you're putting into your mouth and when you're putting it there. And I think I had a kind of a marked improvement in my recovery and what I was able to do in training. Guys, why are you giggling? Come on. You all have filthy minds. That thought didn't cross my mind at all.
No, I was just looking at this coffee holder. Okay, go ahead.
Coffee holder. Speaking of things you put into your mouth. But yeah, it was a marked improvement in terms of what I could ask of myself session to session. I found that, where if I was squatting on Monday previously, I would feel terrible on Friday or Saturday. I could expect a little bit more of myself late in the training week. And kind of that recovery cycle seemed to speed up just a little bit. So I think I do think it's worth spending the time on, or, getting, if you're someone who doesn't use protein powder, going and buying a tub of protein powder just for the ease of it, or using, protein bars, something convenient and easy, right? So you can't make a personal excuse like, I don't want to turn the stove on, which I do that every time I cook. And so it's, and again, enabling yourself to be successful in that scenario, I think goes such a long way. On the flip side of nutrition, and Bryce, you brought this up earlier, is hydration, and that's something that it's like this unspoken thing that we assume that people do right, but so many people do wrong, and it's so easy to fix. It's the simplest thing in the world. Hydration is so straightforward. Drink water. Like it's just, but at the same time, it seems to be a mark that is missed by a large percentage of people. Yeah,
it is. Generally speaking, people want to know how much fluid should I be drinking on a regular basis. And it's as straightforward as using thirst as a marker. So our body's pretty good at letting us know when we should be drinking, and people kind of settle on different amounts of fluid, but you can really use thirst as a marker. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is to, as a helpful habit, if you're one of those under hydrators, is to tie drinking to a habit that already exists. So kind of pairing it to a habit. So after I have my breakfast, I drink a bottle of water. So I've tied that habit to one that I already do.
I think urine color would probably be a better marker than thirst, because I think I could go most of the day without actually feeling too thirsty, and I'd be pretty dehydrated by the end of the day if I wasn't on top of my fluid intake.
Well, how many times do you pee?
5 clear urinations before your training session is a goal, assuming you train in the evening or afternoon. That's what we encourage our athletes to do.
Cool.
So, and if I'm not mistaken, I think thirst is actually a late stage dehydration signal. I don't think it's thirst isn't the first thing you feel when you're starting to need fluid, if I'm not mistaken. So in any case, proactively involving that, after each meal, drinking 16 ounces of water, for example, which might leave you feeling a little bit bloated for about 10 minutes, but just that plus your regular water intake throughout the rest of the day, and you've probably doubled your water intake, and you're getting close to that higher marker where you don't even need to think about it anymore. And again, it's just a simple thing. We talk about nutrition and it feels detailed, but it's one of two factors that we have a direct hand in controlling when we're talking about how we recover. And you can't control your work for the most part. Your training program, if you have a coach or you have someone else, or you're running a program you found online, you have a hand in it. But ultimately, the demands of the program are the demands of the program, and there are times when you can't change that. You absolutely have 100% control over how and when you eat, how and when you drink, and how and when you sleep, within reason. On the sleep, nutrition is the one we have absolute control over, and then sleep secondary to that. And we'll get into sleep next, but to sell yourself short on the nutritional side of things is it's kind of like it's the low hanging fruit, to not pick the sweetest looking, lowest hanging apple. It seems like a silly thing to climb up the tree and go for one at the top instead. On the note of sleep, this is reasonably straightforward, right? sleep a lot. And so, Berto, where would you kind of delve into more specifically kind of giving direction in terms of R&R for sleep?
It's probably the hardest one, and probably the one that I still have the most issues with, is the sleeping. But I think we all know that friend that, for whatever reason, well, usually because if they don't wake up at 5 in the morning, 4 in the morning, and start their day, then they can't get everything they want to do done. And they've developed the ability to be in bed by like 8 or 9 p.m. But this is, again, it's just a habit, just like drinking water. It's a habit. It's something that's just part of their system. And like Bryce said, tying your drinking water to something you do all the time. So it's just something you do. There is no decision-making stress involved with that. So with sleeping, I think that is a huge one. When, especially now that I am dieting, and again, I can feel anything. Like if I had a stressful exchange in traffic at 4 p.m., like I'm still kind of feeling that like by 9 p.m. Like I'm still not over it. And for me, sleep, this prep has probably been the biggest change relative to other preps. And what I've done is, again, just bed is only for sleeping. I don't go lounge in bed. I do my best. I got it down to the point where I don't use electronics 30 minutes before bed, which that took a while to taper. So yeah, I think just chronically, it's probably the one thing that most people, especially nowadays, have the biggest issue with, because there's so many distractions everywhere. There could always be something to do or see if you want to look at it from that perspective. But 60 hours of sleep a week is, to me, the gold standard. And when I do get that in, it is almost like intermediate gains all over again for me. Like things are so much more predictable across the board. Mood, which I think is a great marker in regards to how you are doing in terms of just recovery from training and everything else. Yeah, like my oatmeal tastes like someone put sugar in it. It's that wonderful. So, but it's hard to do, even though I do know what reward is waiting for me on that end.
I wanted to share kind of a real world example from last week that kind of ties it all together and shows how important these recovery variables can be. So one of my guys, Jamie, he's a master's lifter up in Alaska. He works on the Alaskan pipeline up there in the middle of nowhere, usually working pretty long days, gets very little sleep. He has to get up at 2 or 3 a.m. to get his training sessions in. So throughout the course of his training cycle, his life stress is pretty high and his sleep quality is pretty low. So what he did prior to nationals was take 2 weeks off of work, basically doubled his normal sleep, and didn't have the same, work stresses of, being on the job 12 or 16 hours a day. And we got just this incredible super compensation effect where he came in on meet day and just blew up everything, got something like 40 kilo PR total with room to spare. And it was just amazing how much better he was performing those last 2 weeks compared to how he usually trains.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Jamie, and he absolutely killed it. But I was wondering if his protein intake is in line with his body weight.
I doubt it.
That's a whole lot of protein if that were the case.
But I wanted to talk about sleep for a second and say that I think there's this attitude right now where, like, grinding and being like a go-getter means getting less sleep, and means like, you get up before everyone else does, you're working, or you're staying up late and you're working on projects, and like that's seen as this advantage. And I wanted to get your opinion on that.
The more sleep I get, the better I am I'm more productive at the end, even though that initially I see it as like, if I get up now, I can get up and start doing this, and that, and I'll be this ahead of my day. But when I work on my sleep, it's the other way around. It's like, the time that I do spend working is way more productive. I seem to respond actually better to anything training wise. So I think this next off season, once, because that's one thing about starving for prolonged periods, it actually does affect your sleep in a negative way. What I want to experiment with is actually tapering down my volume a little bit and working more so on that end, because I think it's that important. And the cool thing about sleep is that I think most people can sneak in a little bit more than they might tell you so, and it's free. It's there. Like we spend a third of our lives or should sleeping, and it's there for a purpose. It's the one time where your body regenerates from everything, including in I mean, we're not just like, I guess, regular people, but we like purposely like throw all this stress at ourselves and in hopes that we adapt and become stronger. But it's probably the most elusive one. But if it's a good challenge. If it's one thing that you need to work on, try it for a month. Sleep 60 hours a week for a month, and you'll notice a significant difference in regards to just how much more productive you are when it comes to everything, your training. And I think probably the one that I found to be the best was just like my general sense of happiness was just upgraded severely.
Yeah, I've been there too. Before we get off sleep, I wanted to bring up this study, which I think was done in collegiate soccer players. And one of the groups was sleeping 8 hours a night, which is already a lot of sleep. That's pretty close to Alberto's marker there. And the other group just added an extra 2 hours, either in the night or during the day. And going from great to greater even made a difference in terms of performance markers. So sleep is additive.
So take a 2-hour nap in the middle of the workday is what Bryce is getting at there.
Well,
Boss, I got to dip out for lunch.
The difference from 8 to 10 hours is what I'm saying. So sleep is additive.
And I think there's something to be said for there's something to be said for quality of sleep as well. And Berto, you kind of hinted at this with your with what you were saying about no electronics before bed. And this is a conversation I've had with you before. And it's a lot of times that whole process of falling asleep and treating your actual bed as a place that is just for sleeping, right, not for watching TV. I don't keep a TV in my bedroom specifically for this reason, is because I can go in there and I can lay down on that bed and in 10 minutes or less I am out, and I plan it that way. And that's because that's all I want to use that space for is recovery. And obviously this isn't possible for everyone. I've stayed with friends who live in a shoebox sized apartment in New York, and basically the only place for the TV is at the foot of the bed. And in that case, obviously you make do with what you have. But given that scenario where you have the opportunity to treat that space and that time with the same kind of preparatory attitude like you would for warming up before doing a set of squats, right? You're not going to just jump right into a set of squats while you're distracted with something else. You're going to take your time, hopefully you're going to warm up appropriately. And so this is kind of like warming up for sleep, right? You put the electronics aside, you kind of get yourself into that setting where you're ready to lay down and relax, and you'll just fall right asleep so much faster, and a lot of times stay asleep a little bit more effectively.
And the reason I came up with I've never heard, I don't think I did, the 60 hours of sleep a week is because it directly contradicts the 40-hour work week in a way. It's like you're getting 50% more time in bed than, I guess, as we understand, is a full-time job, right? And that's kind of how the ratio should be, or at least it highlights the fact that recovery is that important.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna try a challenge for the next 4 weeks for myself, and anyone that's listening is welcome to join me. Is just to charge my cell phone out of my bedroom. So just to kind of keep it in a place differently and see if I notice any differences in sleep.
That sounds horrible.
Scary almost, huh?
I was waiting for you to say
PR and I miss it.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to say you're going to try sleeping 84 hours a week. And I was
I'm going throw a cheer out there sloth now.
in prep for Worlds, you'll that whole month before the meet, get your 12 hours a night, 7 days a week. Spend half of your life sleeping that whole time. I can get behind that. But again, this is everything we're saying here. This kind of lends to the fact that it's very much in your control. Maybe you can't control the amount of time you have available for you to sleep. Maybe you work 12 hours a day and you have an hour commute each way, and you got to eat, right? And so you only have 8 hours of time between sitting down at the end of the day and leaving in the morning. And you simply can't sleep from start to finish of that. That's really not possible. And so what you can do is ensure that you're getting the highest quality sleep during that time period, that you're getting full sleep cycles. There's apps for that where, it'll track how you move through the night and tell you how long your sleep cycle is, and you sleep some multiple of that amount of time plus however long it takes you to fall asleep, and you're going to wake up feeling a lot more refreshed. You'll wake up feeling better after sleeping 7.5 hours than you will after sleeping 8.25, and that's just related to how your sleep cycles are, not waking up in the middle of one, in the middle of a REM cycle, etc. And investing a little time into things like this. And there's a lot of free resources in terms of cell phone apps and articles on the internet, and moderately humorous podcasts like ours. I was referring to ours there, guys, but it's.
I'm glad you think we're moderately humorous. I feel
well,
honored.
thank you for acknowledging that. That's all I was looking for. But the point is that there's a lot of resources out there that are at your disposal, and so few people make use of them. There's, people who nerd out on this stuff and go and read it. And, Bryce, I know your style of things is you go super ham on a subject for a week. Like, and this is how the TSA coach chat goes. Bryce is like, man, I'm really interested in how ballet plays into powerlifting this week. And so it's like articles all week long. And that's a crazy example that's not accurate, but it's sometimes it's obscure things, but they're interesting. And he just goes absolutely balls to the wall for a week, and then at the end of the week, there's a new subject. Yeah. But if people gave 5% of that to studying how they can improve their daily habits that contribute to their long-term success, it can really lend itself to just a better experience overall. Sleep, I look at as kind of number 2 behind food in terms of what we can control. Because like I said, sometimes you simply don't have a hand in how much time you have available in certain cases. And, you can say, oh, move closer to your work, or, oh, get a job closer to home, or, whatever it may be. But sometimes those things just aren't an option. And that's just the reality of life. People work on Alaskan pipelines and work 16-hour days and sleep 5 hours a night for 7 days a week, 6 months of the year, like Jamie, Eric. And that's a very extreme example, but that's a real thing. That's not made up. Like Jamie really does that. And so there's other people out there doing that as well. And so doing what you can to control it can really, really go a long way. So let's see here. We talked stress, we talked nutrition, we talked sleep. What are we missing? That's part of the big list here. I think these were the big 3 that I wanted to cover.
Yeah. I wanted to go back on stress real quick, because we essentially said, like, this is something we all deal with. Mindfulness, maybe. Deep breaths, maybe. But how do you guys all deal with stress? You're all functioning athletes. Maybe you have different ways of coping with that.
I think the biggest difference for me when it comes to the type of stress that I'm good at dealing with and absorbing versus not is like you mentioned, Bryce, like my response to it. So, for example, really good athletes, I feel, sometimes look at the challenge on their spreadsheet as a chance to improve, as a chance to thrive, and then come competition day, almost with a little swagger. This is my chance to basically show everyone what I can do. And I think the same thing can be applied to, if you don't apply that to your stress, it's something you want to get to, that 8th rep on a squat, you want to see is like, this sucks, but this is how I'm going to improve. And if you take that perspective, helps immensely. You tend to put a positive spin on that. And the same thing with a lot of the stresses that we can't control outside of our life. It's like you got to look at them as a challenge, as opposed to, this really sucks and I wish it wasn't this way, because the truth is you can't do anything about it. You are going to have to put your big boy or big girl pants on and deal with it. So you might as well do it with a different perspective.
So you're kind of alluding to framing, that we can kind of control how we interpret experiences. And I agree. Like, I think that's really good. When stress gets super high for me, just kind of removing myself and taking a few breaths, like back to like 3rd grade ways to deal with situations, like, has really been successful.
Yeah. That's so hilarious. But yeah, that's so true.
Well, sometimes the simplest solution is the right one. You know, the first one you come to is, and so in your case, Bryce, like you said, just the third grade solution. There's a reason it works for third graders, is because it's simple and effective. And, you know, we don't always need some big, long, convoluted solution on how we can deal with stress or situations that are difficult. Sometimes you just need to take a minute, take a breath, and deal with it. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. And which, you know, you don't always want to hear that. But, and you know, in my case, I have this tendency to take on way more than I should. And for me, it's just a lot of times I have to just find ways to disconnect myself. And that's like a beautiful dream for me right now, is to not be on the internet for 2 solid weeks. It is like this. It's almost erotic for me right now, the idea of unplugging from the internet for an extended period of time. And you know, we'll see how that comes to fruition, if it ever does. But you know, just getting it done. Checklists are the things for me. It's like, if I have a list of stuff, it's so satisfying for me going through the process. And once I get past that halfway mark, it's like, that really does it for me.
I wanted to mention that I don't think that number of tasks in the day correlates to stress. So it's not like if you're doing more, you're necessarily more stressed than anyone else.
Right.
Like Hani, you seem to have like a higher quote unquote set point than other people do in terms of the amount of stuff you can handle versus how it affects you. And I think that's awesome.
I wonder if there's a relation to body fat there.
If he eats all the Doritos is what it is.
Will it make you feel better if we say yes?
No, please no. Cool. So I think this is a healthy place for us to stop. So, you know, Alberto, it is always a pleasure to have conversations with you, man. And I am very excited to have you. Actually, no, before we finish, I wanted to add something we missed nutritionally. Alcohol intake. We didn't talk about alcohol intake. And I didn't want to skip that, because it's kind of a hot button item with some people. And, you know, there's like 3 camps, right? So you have the extreme non-drinkers, which is fine. You know, nobody has a problem with anybody not drinking. And obviously that situation is going to be best no matter what. So long as you're not limiting yourself and creating a stressor in social environments, that's going to be best performance. And then you have people on the total opposite end of the spectrum who drink a lot all the time. People who drink every day in substantial amounts. And then kind of in the middle of the moderation, people who maybe have 3 to 5 drinks a week, or maybe 5 to 10 drinks a week. And maybe that's over the course of 2 nights in your average week. And so, you know, where do you want to be on that spectrum for maximizing performance? And maybe there's a time frame for this, right? And so what I've started to suggest for people is, you know, maybe 3 to 4 weeks before your competition, we should see salt alcohol intake. And that'll lend itself to good recovery during your most demanding period of training, and having you feel as best as possible on all of the training days as well as on the competition day. But from a broader perspective, Alberto, I think this is another great question for you. What do you think with regards to controlling alcohol intake? How do we balance that in a way that makes sense for the recovery needs of the powerlifter?
I like your idea, and I think one thing you forgot to bring up is the fact that you get to super compensate post meet, especially if you did your job and you had a wonderful meet. You get, or I guess, soak your sorrows in it. But yeah, it's going to work a lot more effectively once you get it back in there. The thing about ethanol is that even though you feel the exact opposite, is as you're taking it in, you relax, you feel better. The day doesn't seem as heavy as it was pre-drink, so it doesn't appear to be. When it is in your system, your body prioritizes the way it partitions every other nutrient, including all the stuff that's actually going to contribute to recovery. It was actually one of those things that during this marathon dieting phase, it started in late March, it was easier to cut out, because it was one of those things where it's like, shoot, so you only have 2,500 calories. Do you really want to throw that away and I guess use some of that recovery juice on alcohol? So from someone whose system is very transparent right now, it does make a difference. And I think this next off season, when I do start eating and progressing again, that's probably one of my goals, is to cut down my intake, because living in Colorado, where even C- beers are like fantastic, it's really hard to do that. And I'm going to go with, I'd say, about 2 to 3 drinks of your choice a week. If you're really invested in doing everything you can to get better, is probably going to be the top end of what you should have.
How big of drinks are we talking about here?
I'm covering everything when I say that. So if you want to have, like, 3 glasses of wine, 3 super potent beers, you can go with that. Yeah.
Three super potent beers. That's I've got 10% IPAs in my head right now. That's plenty.
Like a 22-ounce rumpkin.
A 22-ounce rumpkin.
That thing, it's in its own league.
Well, I want
Why
to
girls
say,
run away from that one?
I think people like to be told that, like, you could fit any habit in with your goals. You know what I mean? But aren't there inherently some habits that, like, you'd be better off doing less? Like I don't know, like alcohol in this case.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely less is better, right? You can't. There's no counter argument to that. There's no point where you'd be like, oh yeah, drinking is better. It doesn't exist. That's not a real thing.
Right.
But if you turn that into a stressor of its own, the effect that's going to have on you from a stress perspective might outweigh what those 3 drinks a week are going to do to you in terms of recovery. So it's kind of pick and choose your battles. But if you're someone who doesn't drink and you have all friends who don't drink and you're in no way pressured in that environment, then by all means, be a teetotaler, remain that way, and obviously it works for you.
And the goal is not to be perfect across the board, but some people are going to be better at the nutritional side of things, but suck at sleep, and some people are the inverse of that. But the goal is to just be aware of all the things that can contribute to you getting better outside of just the training. And kind of have something to aim for. Like, at some point, like, Bryce couldn't squat 225. Like, it started there, right?
I don't believe that.
He probably could. But it's gonna make us feel good and just say, yeah, there was a point.
No, there was absolutely.
So, but slowly and surely, like, he progressed when it came to his training, and he got stronger, and this is where he's at now. And I think we forget that there was this path to getting there, and I think the same thing should be the goal when it comes to everything you do outside of the gym. And it's important that you start with the tasks and things that you can accomplish. Mm-hmm. So, maybe the whole, like, 60 hours of sleep, you're like, I won't even try because I can't. Like, start with 40 if you're that bad, and then move up from there. But you want to build momentum. You want to build confidence, and then as you're doing that, like, you look back and it's like, oh crap, I just do that stuff and I don't even think about it. I eat protein 4 times a day most of the year. And I remember the first time I heard from someone that no, you got to have protein not just after your workout, but you need a My back?
Yeah.
That was weird.
Okay. Well, yeah, the first time that I heard that you need to have it numerous times throughout the day, I was like this close to quitting bodybuilding, and it was one of those things that slowly got to this point. So yeah, I think all the things that we can do, just like weights, like in slow increments, otherwise you're going to break and have to start from zero anyways.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I want to say is, I think a lot of people these days are focused on training variables, sets, reps, intensity, how many times am I squatting, what kind of movements am I doing, and stuff like that. And it's kind of hard to adopt some of these other strategies for increasing total or different lifestyle changes. But if you tie it to the fact that, hey, this is going to increase an athlete's total, it's going to make it that much easier for them to adopt, because like we all care about our totals a hell of a lot. And if you say like, hey, sleeping more equals bigger total, that's an easier relationship to make for someone to be able to implement some of these habits. You guys agree?
Absolutely. Cool. So alcohol got out the way now. That's all I wanted to touch on that. I meant to bring it up earlier, but I forgot. So like I was saying, Alberto, it was a pleasure to have you on. I've said it before, and I tell people this all the time, but you've been such a huge mentor for all of us. And what you were saying earlier about quitting bodybuilding, the first thought in my head was that would have had the wildest butterfly effect on the online coaching business if Alberto Nunez had never been a coach. And I just think about that. It's like, would 3DMJ have come to fruition if not for that? And there's a whole generation of people who are now in this industry because of you guys. And so it's just crazy to think about the concept of that. And but yeah, man, so thank you. I do appreciate your time and your knowledge.
Thank you. And it was an honor to be on this podcast. I remember when Bryce was like, you know what, I think I want to do this coaching thing. And it was such a crazy idea to him. And I'm like, he proposed coming in with us and joining the team, which would have been a great fit, but we all felt like no dude, like you have no idea. Like, you could start today and it can turn into something pretty awesome for you. And what you guys have done has far exceeded, I think, what Bryce thought was going to happen initially. Oh, yeah. And what all of you guys thought TSA would be like today in 2017. So, watching you guys do your thing on the powerlifting side of things, it's been awesome to watch that total grow. Absolutely. So it was an honor to be here today.
Awesome, man. So as always, you can find Alberto on social media at Nunez 3DMJ. There's no Enye in the social media, so it's Nunez instead of Nunez. We got Bryce _TSA, Eric _TSA, and as always, I'm Hani _TSA. Anywhere you want to find us. One more time, shout out to the sponsor for the podcast, LVD Fitness. You can find them at www.lvdfitness.com. And that's all. TSA podcast, check it out. Thanks, guys.
Later.